Good morning from TechCentral and welcome to our Digital Security and Cybercrime webinar. Thanks to everyone for joining us for today's session as we discuss what should businesses be afraid of for the rest of 2021. I'm now going to hand over to Duncan McLeod, editor of TechCentral and our host and moderator for today's session.
Harry, thank you so much and welcome to everyone and thanks for joining us at this TechCentral webinar this afternoon with Kaspersky. It's great to see such a great turnout and I guess it shows that this is certainly a hot button topic and we've got the guests, top international experts in the area of cybercrime and cybersecurity, and we will be chatting to them in our discussion today. If you were expecting Daniel Gorobets to host this session today, I'm afraid he has unfortunately taken ill. But you're not really here to hear me or Daniel for that matter, but rather our two guests from Kaspersky who I'd like to introduce you all to now. First up, and in no particular order, we have David M. David is Principal Security Researcher at Kaspersky. David, welcome. You're in the UK, London, I believe. How are things over there? Are you all over your lockdowns?
Hi, Duncan. Yes, over in the UK, we're not actually. We're still kind of in the sort of hopefully latter stages of lockdown. I think at the moment they're planning to unlock fully in round about a month's time, but we'll see how it goes.
Okay, good. I actually thought you guys were out of it now with all the vaccinations that were happening there, but you must be close to it anyway. What's the situation over in Russia, Oleg? Oleg Gorobets is Senior Global Product Marketing Manager at Kaspersky, and he lives in Moscow. Oleg, welcome. How's the situation over there?
Yeah, weather is kind of changing nowadays, and yesterday we had a shot of horrible thunderstorms here. We have our office flooded actually. So,
oh my word!
Right during the rehearsal, we were expelled out of the office. So I had to spend some time in the nearby hotel's lobby trying to find myself a place to do this. Hilarious, but not really for a few people who have their cars drowned or hit by a flying roof, so
good grief,
like a nightmare. Yeah,
good grief. So there's widespread damage from these thunderstorms across Moscow yesterday.
Yeah, there was some damage here, so it's still on the news. I just wonder if we are going to have one more shot of this today.
Well, hopefully not during this webinar, Oleg. Hopefully not during this webinar. But it looks like you're ensconced in a spaceship at the moment, so I think you're probably all right.
No, I feel more comfortable here at orbit.
Absolutely. I wish we were all in orbit, right? And the COVID situation in Russia, what's it like there? How are the vaccinations going? Are things under control?
Well, yes and no, because while we have the vaccination running here, there's still lots of people who are not exactly sure if they should do this, and the government is currently taking extra measures to convince people to go and vaccinate themselves, as we have a statistics rising nowadays. So we're reducing our travels using this metro, and the office works is also on the decline. So we have to take care of ourselves a little bit more.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Now, we're in our third wave of COVID here in South Africa, and it's particularly affecting Gauteng, which is the main province in the country with, the richest province in the country, let me put it that way, with Johannesburg and Pretoria. And we're right at the peak at the moment, and our vaccination rollout has been going quite slowly. But I wanted to ask, and the reason I'm talking so much about COVID is I just wanted to get your views, or Kaspersky's views, on the impact that the COVID pandemic over the last 12 to 18 months has had on the world of cybersecurity. Has there been an impact? I mean, obviously, we're seeing a lot more people working at home, and that's obviously had an impact on companies trying to secure endpoint devices. What are some of the things you've seen from a cybersecurity perspective out of this pandemic, Oleg?
Well, we all have to understand that the whole trend of, reducing travel, reducing counteraction between persons, resulted in a huge boost in the digital transformation for many areas of business. So people are moving into digital. It's right everything, all the aspects from the social to healthcare to retail, whatever. But as the more traffic is there, more data is there, so the interest of cybercriminals for the area grows also significantly. Therefore, they're trying to leverage the whole situation when people are working from homes. They're no more under the protection of corporate defensive perimeter, and speaking for ordinary people, as the people are buying more, ordering more online, the bigger is the interest of, benefiting from their mistakes of the conduct online while they do their purchases. I think, David can clarify much more on this because there are lots of tricks used by cybercriminals that are coming straight from the new behavior models the situation dictates.
Well, David, let me bring you in here then. What sort of changes in trends in the cybersecurity landscape have you noticed as a direct impact of the COVID-19 pandemic? What are cybercriminals doing differently?
I don't think actually, Duncan, that they're doing anything different in terms of their approaches, in terms of the methods they use to trying to exploit us at a technical level. They're using all the same kind of mechanisms. I think what's different really with the pandemic is that we have a persistent topic that the whole planet has a vested interest in. So everybody is really interested and glued to any developments. And so what they've got is a persistent topic. It's not like the World Cup or Valentine's Day or Black Friday or Christmas, where it's here today, gone tomorrow. This thing's been with us now for nearly 18 months and counting. So every little development, whether that's input from health agencies or government furlough schemes or delivery companies, they are actually milking every aspect of that. And so it gives them, for those attacks, and that's most of them, which rely on tricking people into doing something that jeopardizes their own security or corporate security, then this gives them a topic that they can latch onto. And I mean, just talking in general about the threat landscape, if we look at the kind of different elements of it in terms of the players, it's still true that the bulk of attacks that we see are these speculative random attacks on individuals and businesses in a sort of blunderbuss approach, hoping to get as many people as possible. But at the top of this kind of threat pyramid, we have much more targeted, much more sophisticated attacks, what we call APTs, or advanced persistent threats. And this includes attacks from nation state sponsored attackers as well. And actually both ends of that pyramid have tried to milk the pandemic as well, because of course, as I said, everybody's interested in it. So it's a great topic for trying to hook people's interest.
Interesting. You use the word blunderbuss. I haven't heard that word in years, David. Good word to use. Elephant gun, if I'm not mistaken, right?
Yeah. Okay.
So, David, the cyber threat landscape is evolving beyond obviously just COVID. COVID has had some specific impacts, but let's talk now about the general landscape and how that's evolving. Clearly, attacks are becoming more sophisticated, difficult to attack or detect and prevent. Please, can you share some of your experiences about the threats we're seeing targeting the space locally and the impact that these are having?
Yeah, absolutely. All of those different players I mentioned, the sophisticated attackers and the what you call opportunist criminals, they're still very, very active. And you're right. I mean, we are seeing, in some areas at least, we're seeing growing sophistication. One example would be ransomware, where gone are the days when we could anticipate that a good deal of ransomware attackers would make mistakes in implementing encryption. These days, that's pretty rare. Now you can pretty much bank on the fact that they will get that right. So they're a lot more sophisticated in what they're doing. We're also seeing financial attacks. And of course, we're used to seeing headlines about high-level attacks, such as those which took place on the Bangladesh bank a few years ago, undermining the SWIFT network, which is used for interbank relations. And those attacks certainly continue, but even kind of lower down that, we're all susceptible to attacks, whether we're bank customers or whether we're a financial institution. So whether the motivation is cyber espionage, in other words, to gather data, or whether the motive is to make a quick buck, or whether the motive is to try and disrupt and cause problems and cause embarrassment or extort money, all of these things exist within the threat landscape. And actually, if we look at the people at the sort of pinnacle of that threat pyramid, the APTs, the sophisticated targeted attacks, we see those within Africa as we do with others. Now, it's certainly true that if you look at where the focus of most of those attacks occur, it wouldn't necessarily be Africa, but no part of the globe is immune from that. And that's true for Africa as well. So threat actors such as Lazarus, which is a very well-known APT threat actor, Oil Rig, Transparent Tribe, Sidewinder, and a bunch of others have definitely, focusing on Africa as well as other parts of the globe. If we look actually at the general threat landscape as it impacts individuals and businesses. It's interesting if you try to put it in some sort of perspective. So if we look at 2020, worldwide, about 10%, little over 10% of computers worldwide experienced at least one malware attack. So that's worldwide. Now, for South Africa, it was in 2020 a little under that, but pretty much hit the average and is comparable, let's say, to North America or to Europe. It's less for some parts of Africa. So, if we think in terms of, for example, Libya or Tunisia, Algeria, Morocco, Somalia, they would have a higher rate, and some parts of the African continent would have a somewhat lower rate, 5 or 6% perhaps incidents. But as I say, for South Africa, it's pretty much comparable to Europe. Now, I checked the figures for the first quarter of this year, and they're a little bit lower, both in relative terms, relative to North America, Europe, and also in absolute terms as well. Again, except for a few countries, Algeria, Mauritania, and Somalia are somewhat higher. So I would say really for South Africa and Africa generally, we're looking at kind of pretty much the same level of hit or the same hit rate as we would see for other parts of the globe. So, when we talk about the threat landscape incorporating the whole globe, that is most definitely true.
It's interesting what you say there. And I was wondering as you were speaking whether there is a correlation between internet access in a country or internet penetration in a country and the amount of cyber criminal activity that you see. Is there a correlation?
Well, there can be. Actually, we certainly see a correlation in terms of the sources of attacks. So, if we track this on a quarterly basis and a yearly basis, if you look at what the sources of the attacks are, in other words, where's the infrastructure that's being used to launch attacks, that definitely goes with where the solid infrastructure, the advanced infrastructure is. No surprise, really, because criminals, like everybody else, worry about availability and uptime. And it's no good them trying to create an infrastructure for attacks. Connectivity is going to be flaky. So they certainly will look at, those countries where the infrastructure is going to be solid. But in terms of where the victims are, there clearly is a correlation because, if we look at a place where there's very little tech used, then, we're not going to see cyber attacks. But in fact, these days, technology is used pretty much worldwide. And that's why wherever we are in the world, we can fall victim to attacks from people elsewhere. Because, going back to what I said about infrastructure being hosted, where there's solid technology, solid connectivity, that doesn't necessarily mean that's where the criminals have to be located. They just make use of it.
Now, David, you mentioned ransomware, and I'd like to just touch on that for a minute because it's been in the headlines in the last little while. Of course, there was the Colonial Pipeline attack in the US, and we saw this high-level summit just recently between Vladimir Putin of Russia and Joe Biden of the US, where ransomware was discussed between the two leaders. Is ransomware suddenly becoming a much more serious issue that we're suddenly seeing it in the headlines, or is it just a case that there were some very high-profile attacks in the recent past?
Well, I think what we've seen is a change in the nature of the ransomware. Ransomware is 15 or more years old, but in the beginning, it was this kind of random approach, whereby they would try to infect as many people as possible and hope that a good number of them were willing to pay, $300 or $400 ransom. What we've seen over the last 5 years, approximately, is a switch away from that. Actually, and it might be surprising to people in the audience, we've seen a decline in terms of the numbers of ransomware families being developed, and we've seen actually a decline in the number of attacks. But at the same time that we've seen that decline, we've seen an increase in the number of attacks which are being focused on particular companies. So they still will try to infect more or less indiscriminately, but what they then do is to kind of qualify those hits, and they look through the victims and decide which ones they think are going to be likely to pay. So they get into the network, they do their reconnaissance. And, that's why when we see things like Colonial Pipeline, or we see the Irish healthcare system, or we see universities and others being hit with ransomware, the people perpetrating this understand exactly, even to the point at which, we've seen cases where a victim has sort of said, well, look, we can't afford to pay that. And the attackers have said, well, we know you can because we're in your network and we can see your accounts. So we're seeing much more in terms of that kind of focus, which is no surprise, therefore, when you hear about some of these ransomware gangs like Conti or Maze and others making hundreds of millions of dollars a year. it's the nature of it was changed rather than the volume, I would say.
Interesting. Now, a question I wanted to actually ask both of you, something that really interests me, and let me start with you, Oleg. What would you say, if you were to pick one or two things in the cybersecurity threat landscape that worry you the most today, what would those two things be and why?
One of them we just have discussed. This is the new version of the ransomware operations. This is really scary because the crypto type we used to know on recently is, well, currently yielding to quite a different model of operations. Well, the encryption process is actually not within the focus. It is not the main focus. The much more danger is doxing, when the data, the private data, the sensitive data are taken out of the system, and those ransomists are threatening to expose them to broader public or to sell them somewhere on the dark web. And this really hurts for many companies because of multiple reasons. This brings in social, the reputation, and the legal aspects together. And what is interesting, that they are using the long chains of approach to penetrate the systems of bigger targets, which brings us to the situation where even smaller businesses, which are participating in longer chains of supply, can be hit by those attackers, and then the trust will be used in order to get to the high level target. Well, as what else here we have, by the way, it's directly connected to our topic, this is financial cybercrime, because it gets much more organized. There are, literally cybercriminal consortiums operating out there. Their models of operation have become much more organized. More or less, they're resembling the regular companies with different departments having different responsibilities. For example, those guys who are doing the initial penetration are not the same, which are browsing through the corporate network in search of the data. And they're not the same who are doing the negotiations. They are, the responsibilities are divided between different parties, very loosely connected and operating within the security of darknet. So this is really unnerving, because in their level of organization, those cyber criminals are, they start rivaling the organizational levels of, nation states. It may sound a little bit, I may be exaggerating, but not much.
Yeah, interesting.
This requires people and governments alike to start, taking another level of approach in battling these operations.
Do you think the authorities are winning or losing the war at the moment, generally speaking?
It's hard to tell. What we can see at the moment is that there are obvious changes in the approaches the authorities are applying to the situations. They try to figure out how to battle it better. So there are new legislations, new procedures. We do not everything about what exactly is happening on the top, but the winds that are blowing over there tell us that there are changes, and it is likely that there will be positive changes, visible changes for us here.
Thanks for that. David, I'm keen to get your take as well. Anything you'd like to add to that list from Oleg, things that really worry you right now about the cyber threat landscape?
Well, I think on the issue of whether we're winning or losing, it's kind of, if you think about housework, you're never going to win against the dust and so on. It's an ongoing job. And that's true also for cybersecurity, whether that's your own security as an individual or business security, or indeed national security as well. It's a kind of charm that you've got to rework continually. What's interesting with that is that there's sometimes inertia in terms of the approach to security. So, there's famous sort of saying that generals at the beginning of a war are always fighting with the tactics of the last war, because that's what they're used to. And so that's why awareness of the threat is so important, actually, whether that's awareness for IT managers and CISOs, or whether it's awareness as it affects the staff within an organization. I think one of the things that worries me particularly is the kind of geofragmentation that we've seen over the last couple of years. So, if you go back maybe 10 years, there were the beginnings, at least, of quite a lot of closer cooperation between nations. And I think over the last couple of years, that's sort of been disturbed to a point where we see, not just within the area of security, but we kind of see nation states being a bit kind of grabby and trying to get their arms around their bit of the internet and looking at, how they can kind of exclude. And I think given that cybercrime is a worldwide phenomenon, I think we need a kind of joined up approach. And, it's true, whether it's law enforcement agencies in South Africa or the UK or Russia or Canada or wherever else, they are restricted by geopolitics. They get to work within a particular geographical area, whereas cybercriminals don't. So somebody sitting in a basement somewhere in Brazil can impact somebody in Russia or South Africa or Australia and so on. So, there are some positives. So Interpol, for example, has really, really ramped up its involvement and also its technical expertise. And, I can give a plug for Kaspersky here, because for the last few years, we've had a couple of people centered on Interpol's global complex, helping them to ramp up their expertise. But, I think we need to recognize that it's a global issue. And I think international cooperation at all levels is really something that's very important.
Fascinating stuff. Just very briefly, David, and out of interest, do you think nation states are becoming a major threat in the cybersecurity field?
Well, I think if you look at what we as humans do, we're doing pretty much the same things we did 100 years ago. We're buying and selling, we're socializing, but we're using technology to do it now. And I think that's true of nation states too. If you go back to 1914, when the First World War broke out, one of the first things that the British government did was to disconnect the telegraph wires which connected it to the continent. Now, that could be right out of the modern playbook. The difference being it's not telegraph wires now, it's internet connectivity. So I think nation states want to do the same things. They want to know what their potential adversaries are doing. Sometimes they want to disrupt them. They want to steal information from them. It's just that these days, like the rest of us, they're using technology to do that. What's different, I suppose, is that the speed at which something gets impacted and the ease with which it can be done is totally different when you compare the cyber to the kinetic world. So what required a kinetic footprint 100 years ago doesn't now. It can be easily done with technology.
Interesting. I wanted to just talk to you about cyber fraud and fraud management, particularly in the South African context. How much of a threat is cyber fraud locally? And, I imagine it's pretty bad here given our generally high crime levels. But David, what is Kaspersky seeing?
I would say it's comparable, really. If you look at any of the developed world where you have a kind of a well-developed banking infrastructure and people who are dependent on technology these days for accessing their money, then you are obviously going to get people who will try to subvert that and direct that money into their accounts as well. So, we are definitely seeing a focus on financial attacks. There's no question of that. I think that sort of falls into sort of two sides. On the one hand, there's what are relatively easy pickings. I mean, it's easier to hack me than it is to hack my bank, for example. At least I would hope so. So trying to capture my one-time passcodes, trying to capture my password, trying to put something onto my computer, some malware, which is going to be able to inject code into the website as a kind of man-in-the-middle approach, all of that is certainly feasible. But we are seeing also attacks on financial institutions as well, and not least because actually over the last few years, we've seen a kind of explosion in the number of players within the financial space. If you go back a generation, it would typically be the traditional banking institutions, whereas now, you've got fintech companies of all kinds. So it is definitely one of those areas of focus, and not surprisingly, because it's one of the obvious ways to get direct monetization from an attack. So if, as a government-sponsored attack, you're looking to get into an organization, capture intellectual property, it could be COVID-19 vaccine information or whatever it is, then you're not really looking to get some direct payoff. If you're a criminal, ideally you want to get money and get it as easily and quickly as possible. So stealing from financial institutions, stealing from their customers is an obvious way to directly monetize your attacks.
All right. Carrie has told me that our poll results are out already, David. So let's have a look at those. We asked two questions, and the first one was, do you have a working definition and process for risk assessment? 76% said yes, and 24% said no. And to our second question, how confident are you in your organization's overall security posture? 20% seems like quite a low number. Very confident, moderately confident, 78% of respondents, and not confident at all, 2% of respondents. Oleg, what are your thoughts on those poll results? Do they meet your expectations?
Yeah, more or less, yes. Even though, as for the first question, I would rather tell that people do not always clearly understand what exactly risk assessment is. And actually, it is the area which can be not, well, straight related to cybersecurity, because it's an operational thing, by the way. So your business operations can be threatened not only by some cyber criminals trying to penetrate into your system and take the data out of it and threaten you with its exposure. It's also, well, how the whole range of services your company is depending on. Is it reliable? What is about to happen to it within a few months, probably? If you rely upon the cloud provider, will it continue going on, or you suddenly will discover that your cloud provider is offline and therefore you just have lost a crucial SaaS you were relying on in your business, and so on. So this is a, well, very big picture, and the cybersecurity is only a single aspect of it. Some of these operational things can be related to cybersecurity as well. For example, if somebody puts your SaaS offline, for example, with a DDoS attack or whatever, you're in danger as well. So therefore, cybersecurity countermeasures are definitely a part of the equation. As for second question, well, it's good to see that people are, well, being realistic in their perception of their corporate cybersecurity level, because we all know that everybody can be hacked. That's just a matter of value companies' IT network containing for the cyber criminals. So the key purpose of cybersecurity is not, well, completely forcing the cyber criminals out of your network, just to make the attack not feasible financially. So the effort would be too big. And this is what we're constantly struggling for. And well, if people see that, this is the reason for companies to take more action nowadays, which is exactly the moment they should do this, because you all know how it works with digital transformation and its negative aspects. Suddenly we have some leap, not a quantum leap maybe, but considerable leap in technology. But what it brings along is new vulnerabilities in systems, in processes, whatever. And cyber criminals are usually very quick to get a grasp of what exactly is happening and how it can be leveraged. On the contrary, when you are inside of all this, you are not able to see the perspective of all the things. So right after this upscaling curve of digital transformation, you usually can see the surge of cyber attacks of all kinds that leveraging the deficiencies. And then after a while, companies and cybersecurity vendors start, well, gaining on the situation and offering the countermeasures. And then you have the whole curve, well, getting down. That's how it works. And I believe this can also serve as an answer to one of our questions from Q&A, right, Carrie?
Well, thanks for that, Oleg. I'm going to get to those Q&A questions now. The question from our anonymous attendee is, how do we combat evolutionary threats that affect the hybrid cloud environment?
Hey, this is a very good question, because I love everything cloud, because this is the future. We are, well, stepping in right now. So one of the biggest challenges with the hybrid cloud IT infrastructure is the lack of visibility, actually, because suddenly the whole paradigm of how we approach the IT is changing. So it is more or less okay when you have the infrastructure as a service somewhere running somewhere in the cloud, but then again, it has some specifics. So you have to make the security of such piece of infrastructure the integral part of your whole system. It's not always that easy. And when it takes all right to the world of SaaS, when the applications are actually web applications, you are not responsible for the underlying infrastructure, and the whole task of protecting that part of your hybrid cloud infrastructure, suddenly it's like this. You used to have it like this, and suddenly you have to approach it like this. And it's really complicated for many IT departments to cope with that. Therefore, we have to try and find those solutions who are using the unified approach to the cybersecurity of the whole thing. You know, probably that there is a concept of SESI, which deals with cloud-based security edge. It's about to protect, different aspects of the cloud, mostly SaaS type out there, all combining together data protection, the access protection, and the connectivity protection as well. Therefore, you would be able to access your resources in a safe manner. Well, this is something different, but still, we have to always remember that the companies are still using on-prem parts of the infrastructure, and it's not going anywhere for, 10 years, 15 years, maybe, especially for bigger enterprises where the things are working okay and they do not have much reason to change them. They can improve and take part of the infrastructure into the cloud, but they still will be running those hybrid type infrastructures. Therefore, we have to be keen to use something that would take all the aspects together, all the different attack vectors, which can be very different compared to between the on-prem and the cloud ones. There is another term which is called XDR, which is now there are debates over how exactly should we treat this term and what is falling into the category. But in my personal perception is that we have to keep a close watch on all the aspects. This can be complicated, but still we have to see the whole picture because it can start with on-prem and then go to the cloud and vice versa.
Oleg, thank you for that comprehensive answer. I think our next question is for David. The question is from Jadiwa Elisha Nyamasizva. He says, hi from Malaysia. David just mentioned the high levels of cyber attacks on very important institutions such as banks and data centers, institutions where security is expected to be at its best and resources almost impenetrable or impermeable. My question to the panelists is, how big is the gap between cybersecurity efforts and the cybercrime rate? Do we see the gap increasing or reducing as more and more services are being exposed to the cyber world? David, do you want to tackle that one?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, to be fair, it ebbs and flows. I mentioned earlier that there's a degree of inertia always with these things in the sense that we see a continually evolving threat landscape, and yet there's always the sort of danger that awareness of that doesn't necessarily grow at the same time, and therefore it's only after we see exploitation of a particular new avenue that then knowledge of that catches up and we start to see it being grappled with. So I think it ebbs and flows. I think one thing which is certainly true is that the attack surface that we present to potential attackers is growing all the time. You know, if you look back 20 years ago, when we talked about cyber attacks, they would almost exclusively involve the desktop and maybe the laptop as well. We weren't really grappling with a mobile problem. And even when mobile malware developers started to develop their code for mobiles in the middle of the first decade of this century, we weren't really seeing that as a serious threat. It wasn't being exploited simply because we were not using the technology in business or for personal life. And it was around about 2010, 2011, when suddenly we saw ramping up. These weren't just for making calls and sending text messages. They were actually for doing your banking or socializing. So we had a whole wave based around the mobile, which impacted defenders because no longer could you rely on having to protect people within the traditional network perimeter, but everybody was stepping outside it. So we had to find a way to implement, I suppose, what you call follow me security, something that went with the individual wherever they were. I think we're seeing a huge wave of that at the moment with the Internet of Things. You know, we're surrounded by smart devices inside and outside the office, actually, at home as well. And Oleg just mentioned the fact that, you know, the attackers are very quick to latch onto these new developments, and they have been, you know, for a few years now. So we've seen things like the Mirai botnet, where they were literally using unprotected or weakly protected IoT devices in order to launch distributed denial of service attacks on significant parts of the web infrastructure. We see it at a consumer level now, just because, you know, if you think of somebody's home, you know, maybe they've got an Amazon Echo or they've got a Google Home device, and, you know, they're sharing all kinds of personal information. They're connecting up to various Wi-Fi networks. and not necessarily thinking about the security aspects of it. And the people developing these devices are not necessarily thinking of the security aspects as well. So I think that said, there are definitely positives out there. I mean, if we look at the poll results, a good number of people there were at least reasonably comfortable about the area of risk assessment. And that's vital. That's absolutely vital. Whether you are a 2 or 3 man band with a business, or whether, you've got 1,000 people or 10,000, you have to do some sort of risk assessment, because unless you know what you've got and where it is and how you're using it, you can't really gain a picture of how you might be potentially vulnerable. And in a sense, that's kind of businesses putting themselves into the shoes of the attacker. Now, whether that means you employ an external penetration tester, or whether you just sit there and you say, well, actually, okay, let's audit our stuff and see what we've got and how somebody might get in. That process of audit and risk assessment is vital. I think probably for me, I would say one of the biggest shifts in terms of defense is being away from, I guess, a view which says we're going to keep an attacker out, to the view which says, let's work on the basis that the attacker is going to get in. And what we actually need is visibility into what's happening on our network, such that we can see what looks anomalous, what doesn't look right for our network. And based on that, we can then go threat hunting. And people tend to think about threat hunting. They think about people in the team I work in at Kaspersky, the global research and analysis team. But actually, if you have a sort of ear into your network and you're able to pick up maybe traffic which doesn't look right, you're looking at something going on an endpoint that doesn't look right, then there are tools out there which you can use to actually go and engage in threat hunting. And actually these days, you can find technology suites which will kind of join up that intrusion detection aspect along with what's going on the endpoint as well. So I think the key is to see this as a moving target, and therefore that risk assessment, it's not just a once done deal. It has to be an ongoing process, again, like the housework in the domestic scenario.
I'd like to get to some of the other questions. We have a question from Maile, who asks, Maile says he's from South Africa. He asks, what are the cybersecurity standards / frameworks out there that seem to be tried and tested? What are the standards used by banking and financial institutions, especially in South Africa? Oleg, do you want to have a crack at that?
I can try to. Well, I cannot probably answer for South Africa in particular, but in general, we all know that the key point in successful defense is not just, setting up some cybersecurity solutions that will be running out there and protecting the system against cybercriminals. This is much more about the whole process. Therefore, how exactly you are dealing with others? How do you understand this is an incident and not just a stray piece of malware that your system just have detected? Is there anything else that your system have overlooked? How you are going to contain the incident, repair the damage, get your system back online with the minimized chance of the attack getting back to you, because cybercriminals can be very persistent in their approaches. So the more mature a company gets, and serious financial institutions will tend to be rather mature in their cybersecurity aspect, they understand that, and this forces them to adopt a systematic approach to their cybersecurity countermeasures, which include the human factor, definitely. The so-called, there is a term I don't quite like, which is human firewall, you probably know. This is about the tactics and procedures and the general knowledge. Your companies start from the very basic level to the top level. By the way, the C-level guys are really usually very, very much attacked. They make a very good selection of targets for cybercriminals. Everybody have to know how to act properly if you're hit by phishing, for example, or how the security officer should approach the situation when he gets it. There is an incident, and so on and so on. It's a great deal of education. And this also takes into certain technical countermeasures like disaster recovery systems, not just cybersecurity. So you have to, isolate the infected segment of the network, put up the backups, run the emergency systems. And it even has a PR aspect, because in case you have you are being hit by the ransomware operation, and you suspect your data were taken out of the system and they're about to threaten you with exposure. You have to prepare some reaction for the general public, especially if you are a public company. There's a whole lot. And as far as I can see, many banks, especially being targets of choice for fraudsters, they're taking it very seriously and responsibly. I remember I was in Kenya in 2014, and we were presenting our solution, which is first fraud prevention, for C-level guys from prominent African banks. And I was amazed how well versed are they in the threat landscape, and the questions they were asking were very clever. So I'm pretty sure the banks in South Africa are keen on implementing the very latest in the safe practices. I hope it answered that.
Thanks, Oleg. I hope that answers the question. The questions are flying in thick and fast now. I'm going to try and get to as many of them as possible, but I am conscious of time. We have about 10 minutes to the end of this webinar. So I think I'm going to pick 2 or 3 questions, and then if there was anything unanswered, we'll try and take those questions, or the Kaspersky team will try and take those questions offline with you. But I'm going to take 2 questions here. The first one is from Robert Bryan. He says, and David, I think this question is for you, distinction between cyber fraud, in brackets, extracting value by deception, versus cyber extortion, in brackets, extracting value by threat. Regulators typically don't fine for fraud, but do heavily for terrorism, financing, or money laundering. Paying ransom compounds the threat. Do you think the regulatory system, including industry bodies, should penalize the target company? For example, if ransom details emerge, would financial sector fine a victim if their controls were found to be weak?
That's a really interesting question. I know at the moment, certainly here in the UK, and I think in other parts of the world as well, the US, there's a bit of a focus, particularly in relation to ransomware, about what do we do to try to kind of lop the head off the business of ransomware? What's the best way to do it? And certainly the National Cybersecurity Centre here in the UK, a number of people involved with that have said, what we need to do is to make paying ransoms illegal. In the same way we would do that for a terrorist attack, for example, or a physical extortion situation, a kidnapping, for example. And their argument behind that is that, if we dry up funds to the ransomware gangs, then their business model starts to peter out, it starts to fail. Others are saying, well, look, you can't really rely on legislation to do that. Actually, my own take on this is, even if there isn't legislation, it may well be that the invisible hand of the marketplace will step in here. A few weeks ago, AXA in France announced that they wouldn't cover ransom payments for customers. That's within France, not globally. And that sort of sets down a marker in the sand, in my view, at the point, I think it sounds great. Let's get cyber insurance. Let's include ransom payments in case we need that. And it gives you that peace of mind. But of course, if we get to a point where these payouts are A, big, and B, numerous, it's likely that the cyber insurance business will start to say, well, hang on, we can't take the hit on this. And therefore, they will start to impose restrictions. And some of them do. And some of them, in fact, will insist that you go through with them, looking at what your cyber defense posture is and whether there are any weaknesses, and will make the coverage dependent on that. So in a sense, I see that as a positive, because, one of the dangers where you have regulation, one of the dangers where you have, something like insurance is it's a bit of a tick box exercise. You look at, am I covered for this? Am I covered for that? Am I covered for the other? And equate that, in a sense, with your defense posture. The opposite argument I've heard from people is, well, actually, if people couldn't resort to a cyber insurer to pay the ransom for them, they would have to ramp up their security because they would be taking the hit if the worst should happen. So it's an interesting thing. And I don't know if there's a right or wrong answer. I think one way or another, legislative-wise or the market, will move in the same direction where they begin to kind of exclude things. As a technology provider, I think I would always look at this and say, well, it's much better to focus on how do we stop this in the first place and defend against it. And that it doesn't just include sort of, protecting endpoints and updating. It means having that visibility into your system, because at the point at which you see the README text saying you need to pay us a couple of $1 million, they've been in your network probably for 2 or 3 weeks or a month. And therefore that early visibility is really important.
It's a difficult one, and I suppose it's something that regulators and policymakers are going to have to provide direction on at some point soon.
Well, yeah, absolutely. And, not only that alone, I know with IoT, which I mentioned earlier, here in the UK, they're planning legislation which will force providers to build security into those devices. So I think the likelihood that we start to see regulators and legislators getting involved is certainly increasing, because there's no question that ransomware is huge business and is having an impact on businesses across the globe.
George says, thank you very much for this insightful discussion. My question is related to the role of fraud management, information, cybersecurity, and other governance structures, for example, risk management, forensics. What is the most optimal framework for how these functions should work together?
2 years ago, I was speaking at Interpol Forum in Singapore, and one of the key problems out there were the disconnection between the different aspects of, society, which is business, which is cybersecurity vendors, and the regulators, the government as well. So there are lots of problems between the three. We can throw in the academy as well, because it's about education and being well-versed in the ways of cybercriminal, how it works. So the key approach here is to make this connectivity work, actually. In the balkanized world of modern, suddenly there is an interesting idea of acting through cybersecurity vendors, because each of these entities, such as, businesses, fraud management, and cybersecurity departments, the government organizations, they often fail to talk to each other, but somehow they talk to us cybersecurity vendors, and this probably is one of our duties for the society, to facilitate this flow of information, because we do not need we can operate it on an anonymized approach, but we also can work the whole lot of information to work for everyone. So I really don't know, because every single sector is affected by the problem of fraud, has its own specifics and so on. But I think the first and foremost thing we have to is start communicating between each other. Banks, healthcare, whatever, because it's all about sensitive data and they are all around. One steals data, for example, for a single institution, which could be, a bank. It can go somewhere and find those people in different systems, and suddenly you have a whole lot of information on a particular person, which can be used for such operation like personality fraud. It's unpleasant. So the flow of information is a key, I believe.
Okay. I think we're going to wrap there. I just want to ask a quick final question, just to get an insight into what Kaspersky offers in the space, Oleg.
Different institutions that are dealing with the financial aspect, they hit really hard, not only directly, as David had already mentioned, but also through the customers, which are most often much easier to hack compared to the banks or payment systems or whatever. So in the end, the financial institutions have to deal with the consequences of fraudulent activities on their end, as this is their job to make people comfortable to offer the best possible service. This is often they try to cover it for the customer, but then have to deal with the negative impact of the operation. Therefore, it makes perfect sense to protect the end user as well as we only can. And there are certain instruments for that, because definitely having a cybersecurity solutions running on somebody else's computers or mobile phones is great. But the bank, they cannot provide a free cybersecurity solutions for everyone, because it takes much more than what banks are usually doing. Therefore, Kaspersky solution, most important part of it, operates on the bank side, and it tries to verify if things that are happening from the customer side, from the user side, are really legitimate. So if we have a real user out there, or probably it's a fraudster who is abusing the credentials they have acquired illegally from their devices, or it could be the same device from the users, but still the patterns of behavior are different because they are doing things they're not supposed to, they do not usually do. We have complicated machine learning-based algorithms that taking lots of indicators together, like the geo, the time, the profile of the device, the time, the operations they are doing. And thus we have been able to tell if we have the real user behind the particular transaction. And in case we have suspicious, we will treat it as suspicious, we can, withhold the operation and give the fraud officer on the bank side time to react. They can postpone that transaction, contact the user directly, ask additional questions if they are, ask for additional authentication procedures, whatever. Because despite it can sometimes complicate operations, it's much worse than if the people would lose their money to the fraudster. Then again, we also have the SDK, which can be used by banks to embed into their banking applications, which serve partly as a security solution running on the customer's devices. It also provides some kind of telemetry to the fraud officer, to the fraud officer system up to the bank, therefore enriching the whole picture of what exactly is happening between the whole parts of the transaction. Therefore, we can secure the user and we secure the transaction even without the presence of customers' devices. But if we have this presence, it would be even better. So this is a long topic by itself. So if you're interested, you can probably mail to us and we'll try to answer the questions to the best of our capability.
Oleg, thank you so much for that answer. And we could have carried on for hours and hours on this topic. Absolutely fascinating. We'll probably have to do this again sometime soon. But thanks to both of you for your excellent insights on the subject matter today. Oleg Gorobets is a Senior Global Product Marketing Manager at Kaspersky, and David M. is a Principal Security Researcher at Kaspersky. Thank you both for joining us on the webinar today. And with that, I'd hand it back to Carrie.
So thanks again for all of you guys for joining us. I really hope that you found today's session insightful and that we answered some of your questions. We always do appreciate your input on our sessions, so please pop me a mail, send us a tweet or email, and let me know what you thought of today's webinar and what you'd obviously like to see in future webinars. Cheers from TechCentral. Please stay safe, and we'll see you guys at the next one.